She entered through the servant's gate, calloused hands, a heart full of debt. He ruled with an iron fist and a hollowness that no amount of power could fill. The day they met, he looked her over and said, "None of the Omegas in this pack could stand this palace. You won't last a day." She didn't flinch, didn't lower her eyes, and that was the beginning of the end of every wall he'd ever built. But the palace had its own plans, and between love and the throne, only one could win. Do you know which one it was? The cold wind off the northern mountains cut through the valley of Varek like a blade. It was the dead of winter in the Pack Kingdom of Varek, a land where alpha bloodlines governed for centuries, where Pack hierarchy was older than memory, and where the great walled palace of the Dawnfang Pack rose above the city like a second mountain, built not for men, but to make the sky feel small. Lena had never been this close to those walls before. 22 years old. Dark auburn hair that the wind refused to leave alone. Hands rough from years of work in her father's spice kitchen. A beta merchant who had once been prosperous and now was neither. Her mother had died 2 winters ago. The debts had grown like frost after that, quiet and relentless, spreading over everything her father had built until almost nothing was left. Lena was the eldest. So Lena did what eldest daughters do when the world collapses. She went forward. The position of kitchen worker in the Alpha King's palace had appeared like a breath of luck, and she signed the contract without hesitating, but no one warned her what she was walking into. When the heavy carved doors opened before her, Lena stopped. The inner courtyard was larger than the entire quarter where she had grown up. White stone arches, running fountains singing in every corner, an obscene luxury in a city where the poor bought water by the cup. The walls were covered in deep blue and crimson tilework, each piece hand-painted by craftsmen who spent months on a single panel, as if every tile were a prayer. Lena didn't know any of that. She only knew she had never seen anything so beautiful in her life, and that she was terrified. "You're the new kitchen hand." The voice came from a tall woman with dark eyes, like cured olives, dressed in embroidered wool, even her silver-streaked hair braided with pack cord, the mark of a senior household leader. Marta, head of the pack household. She assessed Lena the way a trader at market assesses a bolt of cheap cloth. Hands. Lena extended them without flinching. Marta turned them over, studying the calluses, the small scars from hot fat and sharp knives. "At least you've actually worked," she murmured, almost to herself. "The last 3 who came before you had never lit a fire in their lives." A ripple of laughter drifted from a nearby corridor. Lena glanced up. 3 women watched from behind a column, beautiful, sharp-eyed, scented with expensive oils. The tallest, with black hair and a smile that was not a smile, looked directly at Lena. That look was a warning. Lena filed it away. Her room in the servant quarters was small and clean, sheer with a high window that let in a rectangle of morning light. A thin mattress, a water jug, a small, polished metal mirror. She sat on the edge of the mattress and closed her eyes. "Father," she thought, "I do this for you." Then she opened them and went to work. The palace kitchen was a world of its own, vast, loud, fragrant. Dozens of pots bubbling at once, meats on spits over deep coals, golden bread coming out of stone ovens. The head cook, Brahm, was wide and loud and ruled everything with a wooden ladle he used equally for tasting soup and knocking the heads of the careless. Lena found her footing fast. She knew how to work, how to cut, season, balance flavors with instinct rather than guesswork. Her mother had taught her that cooking was a form of love, that every dish carried the intention of whoever made it. By the 3rd day, Brahm called her his best right hand. By the 5th, the other kitchen workers watched her with quiet jealousy. None of that mattered on the 6th day, when he walked in. It was afternoon. The kitchen was more agitated than usual. The Alpha King would receive pack lords from 3 territories for a state dinner. Lena was at the stone mortar, grinding cardamom and clove, focused and unhurried. Then the silence fell. Not the peace silence. The other kind. The kind made of respect mixed with fear. She felt it before she turned. Alpha King Kalen Dawnfang stood in the kitchen entrance. Tall, broad-shouldered, a dark wool mantle with silver wolf thread at the collar, his pack mark visible at the base of his throat, the iron wolf, oldest symbol of Dawnfang lineage, a close-cropped beard framing a face of hard lines and sharp angles, wan eyes. Amber, the color of pack fire, the color that dominant alphas carried in the old bloodlines. Eyes that were currently moving across the kitchen with the expression of someone who inspects and does not approve. Brahm was already bent double in deference, stumbling through explanations of the dinner menu. Every servant had their head down. Every servant except Lena. She hadn't realized she was supposed to lower her eyes. Or perhaps she had, and her eyes simply didn't obey. The Alpha King's gaze swept the room and stopped. On her. 2 seconds. 3. An eternity wearing the disguise of a moment. Lena felt her heart kick, but she didn't look away. Not from courage, not exactly. From instinct. Because there was something in those amber eyes she couldn't name. Something that wasn't just authority. Not just coldness. Loneliness. Kalen looked away first. Said something to Brahm about the main dish. Turned and left. The kitchen noise rushed back like a wave. Brahm straightened and stared at Lena with the eyes of a man who has just watched someone survive a fall from a great height. "Girl," he whispered. You held his gaze. Lena turned back to the mortar. Someone had to. That night, in the Omega quarters of the Pack household, the black-haired woman, Silra, the king's current favorite, heard the report from her attendant. The new kitchen hand. The look she hadn't broken. Silra sat before her mirror, lining her eyes with practiced calm. "Every day?" she said without changing her rhythm. "Yes, my lady." The hand paused, just for a moment. "She won't last a week," Silra said, adjusting her earring. But there was something in her voice that did not sound like certainty. It sounded like the first note of alarm. 3 weeks into Lena's time at the palace, Alpha King Kalen did not appear for his morning pack council. That had never happened before. The lords waited in the great hall for 40 minutes, exchanging careful sidelong looks, no one saying what everyone was thinking. Marta was called first. She arrived at the royal chambers, knocked twice with her customary precision, and entered without waiting, the privilege of a woman who had governed this household for 15 years. Kalen was propped against the pillows, one hand pressed to his left temple. The headache had started the night before and hadn't broken. A deep, pulsing thing behind his eyes, like a war drum that wouldn't stop. I've sent for the pack physician," Marta said, her voice as even as always. "I don't want him." Marta knew that tone. It was the tone that ended conversations. "Then what does your grace require?" "Something simple. Something that actually works. Not Aldrich's bitter powders that do nothing." Marta stood still for a moment. Then, almost without meaning to, she remembered something Brahm had mentioned the previous evening. The new kitchen hand. The way she used herbs in unusual combinations. Lavender and peppermint together, a cold compress of a particular leaf. She'd learned it from her mother. It was a small decision, the kind that changes everything. Lena was cutting ginger root when Marta appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You," said Marta, with her customary absence of preamble. "They tell me you know medicinal herbs." Lena wiped her hands on her apron. "My mother taught me some teas and compresses. Nothing grand. The king has a bad headache. What would you use?" Lena's heart jumped, but her face stayed quiet. She thought for 2 seconds. Peppermint, dried lavender, a little clove. Steeped hot, not boiled. And a cold compress of broadleaf at the back of the neck while he drinks. My mother used it when my father had his worst days. Marta studied her for a long moment. "Come with me." Lena had never climbed those stairs. The royal chambers were on the upper floor, reached by a white stone staircase with a worked bronze rail. With each step, the air changed, less kitchen smoke and spice, more cedarwood and cool stone, and something older. Pack amber. The scent that alpha bloodlines carried deep in the bone. Ismarta stopped outside a tall ironwood door. You go in. You prepare the tea at the brazier inside. You serve it and you leave. You do not speak unless he speaks first. You do not, I understand, him directly. You do not, I understand, my lady, said Lena. Marta paused, looked at her. There was something in the girl's voice, not arrogance, not fear, that was difficult to name. Rootedness, Marta thought. Like she's planted. She opened the door. The chamber was vast and half dark. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the light. Silver candelabras cast dancing shadows over the walls, which were hung with pack banners. The iron wolf of Dawnfang, silver on black. Kalen lay on his side, back to the entrance. Lena crossed to the small brazier in the corner where a copper kettle waited. She worked in silence, heated the water, measured the herbs by touch and smell, the way her mother had taught her. The scent of peppermint began to move through the room. Kalen stirred, did not speak. She knew it wasn't time. She kept working. When the tea was ready, she set it in a white clay cup with a care that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with genuine attention. Then she took a clean cloth, wet it in the cold water from the bedside jug, and approached. Your Grace, she said quietly, the tea is ready. And if you'll permit, the compress at the back of the neck helps the pain break faster. My mother always did it this way. A long pause. Who are you? His voice was rough, more human than she'd expected. Lena, the new kitchen hand. Silence. Then, without a word, he turned slowly and sat on the edge of the bed. Lena saw his face up close for the first time, without the mantle of authority, without the pack-mark weight of a state appearance. Just a man with pain written across his brow, amber eyes dull with exhaustion. She recognized the expression immediately. It was the one her father wore on the worst days, when the hurt wasn't only in the body. She said nothing. She placed the cold compress at the back of his neck with firm, steady hands. No hesitation. Then she stepped back and held out the cup. Kalen looked at her. She held his gaze, not with challenge, not with fear. Just presence. He took the cup, drank in silence. 10 minutes later, the pain had halved. 20 minutes later, he was asleep. Lena gathered her things quietly, dimmed one of the candles to deepen the dark, and moved toward the door. Kitchen hand. She stopped, turned, while his eyes were half open. How do you know how to do that? My mother taught me, Your Grace. Was she a healer? Lena held back a small smile. No, just a woman who loved her family very much. Silence. Come back tomorrow, with more of that tea. Lena inclined her head and stepped out. She pressed her back against the wall for a moment, her heart beating harder than she wanted to admit. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, something she didn't have a name for yet. In the days that followed, Lena came back. Every morning, always with the tea, always in silence. And slowly, the way frost melts from the inside of glass, the silence grew words. Kalen asked small questions about herbs and flavors, about the city markets, what things cost, whether the northern caravans had come, whether it was true the mountain passes were snowed in early this year. They were the questions of a man who had not spoken with someone who wasn't required to agree with him in a very long time. Lena answered with honesty. No flattery, no performance. Once, when he declared that the saffron he'd had imported from the eastern mountains was the finest available, she disagreed without blinking. The Highland saffron is better for sweet dishes, Your Grace. The eastern variety is stronger, excellent for slow-cooked meat. It depends entirely on what you're trying to do. A long silence. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile, but it was the closest he had come to one in a very long time. Silra noticed. She always noticed everything. She had eyes throughout every corridor of the palace, attendants who owed her favors, or household staff who reported to her in exchange for her protection. She had studied this palace the way a general studies a battlefield. She knew that Calen had closed his heart after Ira, his bonded mate, killed 3 years ago when her carriage overturned on the road between the mountain provinces. She knew that he had become cold, not because he was cruel, but because a king who grieves publicly is seen as unstable, and stability is the only currency that never loses value in a pack court. She knew that she herself, despite 3 years of effort, had never gotten more than his surface attention. And she knew, with the instinct of someone who has spent years watching power shift, that the kitchen girl with the steady eyes had gotten more in 3 weeks than Silra had managed in 3 years. And so she did what women in pack courts have always done when they need real leverage. She went to the council lords. Lord Brennan, the king's senior advisor, a man of 60 with a white beard and a traitor's eyes, who had served Calen's father before Calen and considered himself quietly more important than any king born after he'd already been governing the pack. "The king is becoming distracted," Silra said, meeting him in the east corridor where she knew he'd pass after afternoon council. "Direct. No theater. A kitchen servant. That cannot be good for pack stability." Brennan studied her with the calm of a man who calculates before he speaks. "The king has the obligation to form alliances through bonding," Silra said. "The Ironhold pack has a daughter. Educated. Well-blooded. If the alliance would benefit everyone." A pause. "Everyone," Brennan repeated with just enough emphasis to show he understood exactly what she meant. "Everyone," she confirmed. 3 days later, the council formally proposed the bonding arrangement to Calen at the weekly state assembly. Lena found out from Brom. He pulled her aside in the kitchen, his voice dropped so low she had to lean in. "The lords have proposed a bonding match for the king. A noble daughter from Ironhold. Political alliance. They're going to push." Lena absorbed that in silence. "He hasn't agreed yet," Brom added. "But Lena," he hesitated. "You understand what's happening here, don't you?" She understood. She had understood from the beginning that the palace had its own laws. Older than any feeling, stronger than any warmth shared in a candlelit room. She went back to her room that night with a new weight in her chest. Sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time. Thought about her father at home. About the debts not yet settled. About the way Calen had laughed, briefly surprised at himself, entirely real, on an afternoon when she'd disagreed with him about spice. And she thought about leaving. It would be simpler. She was a kitchen hand. He was an alpha king. The world had built that distance with centuries of careful work. Then came the night Silra went too far. Lena was descending the servants' staircase when she heard voices from a side chamber, the door slightly ajar. She stopped. Instinct, not curiosity. "The sleeping herb is undetectable in tea," said a voice she didn't recognize. "That's not what I want," said Silra's voice, flat as winter stone. "I want something that makes her seem unstable, erratic. A kitchen worker who has lost her mind cannot remain in the palace." Lena stood in the dark corridor. Didn't breathe. Every heartbeat sounded like a war drum. Then footsteps moved toward the door. She went. Not to her room. Not to the kitchen. She went directly to the royal chambers. No summons. No tea. No protocol. She knocked with a firm hand. The corridor guard stared at her in disbelief. But before he could speak, the door opened from the inside. Calen stood in the doorway. He saw her face. His expression shifted. First surprise, then something sharper, reading that something was wrong. "Come in," he said. She told him everything. No drama. The same direct voice she used to discuss recipes and herbs, looking at him steadily while she spoke. Calen listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence lasted 20 seconds. She counted each one. Then he stood. "Go back to the kitchen quarters. Don't leave until I send word. Your Grace, I only wanted you to know. Lena." He said her name for the first time. She went still. "I heard you." His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that was completely different from the coldness she'd found on the first day. "Now go." That night, Silra was summoned to the royal chambers. She left an hour later, her face the color of new snow. 2 days after that, she and her 2 companions were relocated to the secondary Pack estate in the eastern province. A quiet exile, the kind of punishment that, in the language of the palace, says everything without saying anything at all. The Pack household went silent for a full week. Islena didn't celebrate. Her mother had taught her that celebrating another person's fall was always too early, and always cost something. When Kalen summoned her that afternoon, he was standing at the window as he always did, looking out over the wolf runs below, the mountains beyond, the pale winter sky. He turned when he heard her steps, and she saw in his face something that hadn't been there before. Not the headache, not the cold authority, the weight of a decision not yet made, but already known. "The council wants me to accept the bonding with Ironhold," he said without preamble. Lena said nothing. "It's a sound political alliance," he continued. "They're not wrong." "No, Your Grace. And you?" He turned from the window. "What do you think?" Lena was still for a moment, an impossible question. She knew that. "Well, I think Your Grace knows what you need to do," she said at last. "And I think Your Grace also knows what you want to do. And I think those 2 things are not always the same." He looked at her for a long time. "You never make it easy," he said, with that almost smile that had become the most precious thing she knew. "That was never what you needed, Your Grace." The silence between them held one long breath, and in it lived everything that had not yet been said. Spring arrived in Varek without warning, the way it always did. The palace courtyards filled with white blossoms overnight. The fountains ran again. The wolf runs greened. And Kalen made his decision. He had lain awake with it through the last weeks of winter, weighing the Ironhold alliance, the council's expectations, the long tradition of his bloodline, marrying for political gain. He had thought about Ira, about the promise he'd made himself in the months after losing her, that he would never again give anyone the power to break him the way her death had. And he had thought about Lena, about a look that didn't break, about steady hands placing a cold compress with the care of someone who actually noticed whether you were suffering, about the afternoon she'd disagreed with him about Saffron and he'd laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised and entirely his own, for the first time in 3 years. On the morning he decided, Kalen called the full council. Lord Brennan arrived with the satisfied expression of a man expecting confirmation of the Ironhold match. He settled into his seat and arranged his expression for gracious agreement. Kalen entered, sat, filled the room the way he always did, shoulders open, gaze direct, authority occupying the space before any word was spoken. "There will be no bonding with Ironhold," he said, the same voice he would use to announce a military order. Silence. Brennan opened his mouth. "Your Grace, the Alliance." "There will be no bonding with Ironhold," Kalen said again, slightly quieter, and that slight drop in volume was the only warning he ever gave before a decision became final. Brennan closed his mouth. "There is a woman in this palace," Kalen continued, "who came through the servants' gate carrying cardamom and her father's debts. In less than a month, she made me remember that I was still a human being." A pause. "That is worth more than any political alliance." The great hall was absolutely still. So then the Alpha King said the last thing that needed to be said. "Prepare the bonding contract." In the old Pack law, the bonding contract was the sacred union, legal, spiritual, and wolf bond together. The law permitted a free Alpha to bond with a woman of any origin, provided there was mutual consent and the proper bond gift, a sum given by the king to the bride, her permanent and protected property. It had happened before, rarely, but it had happened. A woman of no title, no lineage, made a bonded queen by the choice of a king who had decided that the soul in front of him mattered more than the name. Lena found out from Brom. He walked into the kitchen with an expression she had never seen on that generally red-faced and shouting face, something between amazement and a sheepish kind of joy, the look of someone witnessing something they didn't expect to believe, but do. "Lena," he said, his voice catching slightly, "the king has summoned you. And it's not for tea." She set down her knife, breathed in, went. Kalen was in the central courtyard when she arrived. the one she had first seen on that terrifying morning, which now with the blossom trees in bloom looked like something impossible, a painting rather than a real place. He turned when he heard her steps, and for the first time since she had known him, Lena saw something in his face that had not been there before. Not authority, not cold. Peace. The kind that belongs to a person who has made the right decision and knows it, not because it was easy, but because it was true. He walked toward her. "I could tell you it's a practical decision," he said. "That you're capable, that you know medicine, that the pack needs a queen with her feet on the ground." Lena waited. "But the truth," he said, his voice dropping, "is that you made me laugh when I had forgotten how, and that has no political name." Her eyes burned. She didn't let the tears fall. She never did easily. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady as always, "you know I'm the daughter of an indebted beta merchant from the lower city, that my hands have calluses, that I will keep disagreeing with you about saffron. I know. For the rest of your life." Kaelin laughed. That laugh, the real one, brief and surprised at itself. "I know," he said again. "That's exactly why." The ceremony was simple by palace standards. No weeks of celebration. Yes, no delegations from distant packs. No 100-dish feast. Kaelin had insisted. What matters is the contract and the consent. Everything else is theater. The bond vows were read by the pack elder in a small hall with only the required witnesses. Marta, who had been crying quietly in the corner and would deny it for the rest of her days. And Brom, specially invited, who appeared in the finest coat he owned and smelled distinctly of cardamom. When the elder asked Lena if she accepted the bond, she answered with a clear voice, "I accept." The years that followed were years of building. They were not easy years. A pack court is never easy. A man with Kaelin's history does not open completely overnight. There were days when Ira's shadow passed across his eyes, as in Lena had learned to recognize it and give it space, because real love doesn't erase the past. It lives alongside it. There were council lords who treated her for years as the kitchen girl who'd climbed above her station. She let them think that, while quietly learning the name of every one of their children, every pack alliance they'd made, every weakness in their arguments. Slowly, they began to understand that the woman beside the king was not just steady. She was extraordinary. Kaelin saw it, loved her more with each passing season. Children came. A son first, Rowan, with amber eyes identical to his father's, and his mother's unshakable calm. When Kaelin held him for the first time, he went quiet for so long that Lena reached out and touched his arm. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes, it for the first time without any shadow at all, that he had fully come back to himself. Then a daughter, Nell, brown-haired and opinionated, who by age 3 was arguing with the household staff and would, everyone agreed, be entirely ungovernable. Kaelin watched her with a mixture of despair and pride that Lena found the funniest thing in the world. There was a scene that repeated itself many times across those years. Kaelin arriving at the end of a long day, exhausted from councils and decisions, and the weight of governing a pack kingdom that never stopped needing something, and finding Lena in the palace kitchen. She had never fully stopped cooking. Not because she was required to. She was the bonded queen. She could have never touched a pot again. But cooking had been the first language she'd learned to care for people with. She saw no reason to change languages just because the address had changed. Kaelin would sit on the bench Brom had installed beside the work table, installed after the 3rd time the Alpha King had appeared in the kitchen without ceremony, and stayed without explanation. And he would sit without words, sometimes just present. And Lena would cook, and the scent of cardamom and peppermint, of ginger and clove, would fill the kitchen the way it had on that first day, when 2 strangers met over a stone mortar, and something invisible decided they would not remain strangers for long. There is an old saying in the Packlands, love grows by the root, not the surface. Not through beauty or wealth or bloodline, through the root. Yelena had arrived at the Dawnfang Palace as a frightened young woman carrying herbs and her father's debts and hands calloused by a life that didn't wait for anyone. And she had stayed. Not because the king commanded it, not because the palace convinced her. but because she had found in a broken man armored in coldness and grief the same thing he had found in her. Someone who saw past what was shown. Someone who stayed. And when their grandchildren would one day ask how the story had begun, Lena would smile, that smile the years had given her, rooted and whole, and say, with a cup of peppermint tea, and a man who had forgotten how to ask for help. And Kalen, beside her, would pretend he hadn't heard, but the corner of his mouth would move. The same smile as always. Real. Completely real. This is why we tell stories. To remind ourselves that love doesn't choose a title or a bloodline. It chooses a soul. If this story reached something in you, share it. Let it travel further than it came.